The ranch was silent. For years, his only company was the wind through broken fence posts, the creak of an empty rocking chair, and the weight of his own solitude. But one night, a sound he had not heard in years. Knocking. 10 figures stood in the shadows, their eyes sharp, their voices steady. Apaches. They asked for shelter, nothing more. Yet what followed in the hours after that knock would tear open every scar he had buried, test the edges of his humanity, and alter the course of his life forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Elias Rawley had once known laughter on his ranch, the kind that spilled across the prairie like sunlight, carried by the voices of his wife and little girl, by the jingling of harness and the lowing of cattle, by the easy rhythm of work done shoulder to shoulder with men he called friends. But those days had long since been stolen by war and sickness, leaving behind only a hollow shell of land and a man who wandered it like a specter. The fences sagged as if mourning their neglect, barbed wire curled and rusted, fence posts half swallowed by creeping weeds. The corral stood empty, its gate broken, the dust inside undisturbed for years. His cattle were gone, scattered or slaughtered in raids, and he had neither the will nor the help to replace them. Each morning he rose before dawn, but not out of necessity, simply because sleep never lingered long. Chased away by the echo of rifle fire in his dreams and the image of his daughter's hand slipping from his as fever carried her away. He cooked beans over the same hearth where once his wife had baked bread, and every spoonful tasted of ash and memory. The rocking chair on the porch creaked when the wind hit it, and sometimes he thought he saw it move on its own, as if she still sat there, watching the horizon. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and constant, a silence broken only by the low whistle of wind through the gaps in the boards, or the occasional coyote cry that seemed to mock his loneliness. At night, shadows lengthened into phantoms, and he spoke aloud without realizing, answering voices that were no longer there, confessing his sins to a darkness that gave no reply. He kept a rifle close by, though no one came. Years had taught him the world was a treacherous place, but solitude had convinced him the world had already forgotten he existed. Yet some part of him clung to the ranch, to the soil beneath his boots, as if leaving would mean letting the last of them slip away forever. He told himself the work mattered, mending a fence that no cattle would test, patching a roof that covered no one but him, drawing water from a well he scarcely drank from. But deep down he knew he was keeping vigil over ghosts. The prairie stretched endless around him, a vast ocean of grass and dust, and he stood at its center like a stranded shipwreck, waiting for something he couldn't name, something he barely believed would ever come. And still, every evening as the sun bled across the sky in streaks of fire, Elias sat on the porch, hat pulled low, staring at the horizon, as though daring it to deliver him a sign or a knock to break the silence that had consumed his hollow years. The day had been like any other, the kind that blurred into the next, Elias moving through his routine with the slow rhythm of a man more accustomed to silence than to sound, until the horizon burned low and gold and he found himself once again sitting on the porch, hat tilted forward, boots planted heavy against the warped wood, staring at nothing and everything all at once. The wind carried the smell of dust and sage, and the creak of the rocking chair was the only heartbeat of the evening until it wasn't. The knock came sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like a bullet through still water, and Elias froze, his breath caught halfway in his chest. He could not remember the last time anyone had touched that door, the last time he had even heard a human hand strike wood, and for an instant he thought it must be some phantom trick of his weary mind. But then it came again, 3 deliberate raps, steady, certain, insistent. His hand slid to the rifle propped against the wall, fingers curling around the worn stock out of habit rather than intent, and he stood, every muscle taut, his body alive with a tension he had not felt in years. He opened the door slowly, and in the dim spill of twilight, there they were, 10 Apaches, their faces shadowed by the dying sun, their eyes burning with the calm fire of a people who had walked far, who had endured much. Their clothes were torn, dust clinging to skin and leather, their hair long and wind-tangled, but their bearing was proud, unbroken. Among them were children, no taller than his waist, standing silently beside women who looked both weary and unyielding, and at their center a man who seemed carved from stone, his eyes deep wells of silence, Elias felt the old stories rising in him, the ones whispered in camps and shouted in saloons, stories of raids and bloodshed, of cattle stolen and ranches burned, and his hand tightened on the rifle as if those tales might spring to life before him. But then his gaze fell on a boy clutching his mother's skirt, eyes wide not with defiance but with hunger and exhaustion, and something inside Elias shifted. The man at their head raised his hand, palm open in a gesture of peace, and in halting English, he said the words, "Shelter, for the night." They asked for nothing else, only a place to rest. Yet Elias felt the weight of it as though the earth itself had tilted beneath his boots. His instinct screamed to turn them away, to guard his door as he always had, to preserve the fragile sanctuary of his solitude. Yet his heart, scarred and silent for so long, pulsed with an unfamiliar ache as he looked at them, proud yet weary, strangers at his threshold. In that moment, Elias stood between two worlds, the one of fear and the one of compassion, and he knew whichever choice he made, it would carry consequences that would echo far beyond that night. Elias stood in the doorway, the weight of the rifle pressing heavy in his hand, the silence stretching between him and the strangers until it felt like the night itself held its breath. And in that pause, he felt the old instincts flare, the hard lessons of frontier life, the whispers of neighbors long gone who warned never to trust those they once called enemies, the voice of his own fear reminding him that survival depended on solitude. But then his eyes caught on the smallest among them, a girl no older than his own daughter had been when fever stole her away, her dark eyes wide and weary, her cheeks streaked with dust, and something inside him cracked like a brittle fence post in the wind. Slowly, as though betraying himself, he lowered the rifle and stepped aside, his throat dry as he muttered words he had not spoken in years. "Come in." They entered single file, moving with a quiet dignity, their moccasins barely whispering against the wooden floorboards, and though their numbers filled the cabin, they carried themselves with restraint, their eyes scanning the walls lined with old tools, empty shelves, and the cold hearth as though taking measure of the man who lived among ghosts. Elias felt their presence like a storm trapped within four walls, silent thunder in the air, a pressure that shifted the very weight of the room. He closed the door behind them, and for the first time in years, the latch clicked against a night not empty but full. They settled carefully, the mothers drawing children close, the leader taking his place near the hearth though it held no fire, their voices low and measured, their hands never straying near the blades at their belts. Elias remained by the door, heart hammering, suspicion gnawing at him with every breath. He knew these were people hunted, driven by desperation, and desperation could be as dangerous as steel. Yet even as his mind tallied risks, his heart betrayed him each time his gaze strayed to the children. He saw flickers of the past, his little girl's laughter ringing in the same space, her small feet pattering across the same floor, his wife's gentle hands smoothing hair at bedtime. He felt the memories like fresh wounds, raw and aching, and in their presence, the ghosts of his family seemed nearer than ever before. He caught himself studying the leader, a man whose silence was as heavy as Elias's own, his face etched with lines of loss and endurance, and in that mirror Elias saw not an enemy but a reflection of his own exile. Still, the unease clung to him, the war between suspicion and humanity raging with every glance at the knife handles glinting in the firelight's absence, with every shuffle of feet on his floor. He kept his rifle propped within reach, yet he could not bring himself to force them out. In allowing them inside, he felt as though he had torn down the last barrier of his solitude, and though fear prickled along his spine, a quiet truth whispered through him. His cabin, empty for so long, had begun to breathe again. The cabin breathed with a new kind of silence that night. Not the empty, suffocating quiet Elias had grown used to, but a silence layered with present soft breaths of children drifting toward sleep, the low crackle of firewood catching and settling in the hearth, the rustle of leather and cloth as weary travelers shifted in search of rest, and within it, Elias sat rigid on his chair near the fire, rifle leaned against the wall, his eyes roaming over faces half-lit by flame, their features carved sharp in shadow and gold, like living sculptures of endurance. Few words passed between them. Their leader spoke once, a brief thank you murmured in broken English, and after that only gestures and nods bridged the gap between their worlds, leaving Elias adrift in thought. He had not shared his fire with another soul in years, had not felt the weight of another man's gaze lingering on him, nor the soft sound of a child shifting against a mother's chest in the deep of night. And though his instincts bristled, there was something profoundly human in the closeness, something he had not realized he hungered for until it was there. His eyes kept straying to the boy, the one who seemed too restless for slumber, his sharp gaze wandering the cabin, studying the tools, the shelves, the rifle, until it landed on the old rocking chair in the corner, the one that had stood empty since the day his wife had last leaned back in it, her hand resting on her swollen belly, her voice humming softly to their child-to-be. Elias's heart clenched as the boy's stare lingered, and before he could move or speak, the child crossed the room and, with no hesitation, climbed into the chair. It groaned beneath his slight weight, the wooden runners scraping against the warped boards, and slowly it began to rock, forward and back, carrying with it the sound of memory. Elias's chest tightened, the past flooding him in a rush so sharp he thought it might tear him in two. His wife's laughter rising with the chair's gentle rhythm, his daughter's squeal as she clambered into his lap, the warmth of family gathered close in that very spot. The boy's face was solemn, as though he knew the weight of what he had touched, though perhaps it was only Elias projecting his grief into the child's innocence. And then it happened, unexpected, unbidden, yet undeniable, a sound breaking loose from Elias's throat, a rough, low chuckle that rose into a laugh, rusty from disuse but real. The Apaches turned their eyes toward him, their expressions unreadable. But in that moment, Elias felt none of the old shame of revealing himself, none of the fear that laughter would echo only to vanish into emptiness. For the first time in years, the silence of his cabin had been pierced not by ghosts but by life, and though the fire burned low, dwindling to embers, something within Elias stirred to flame again, fragile but undeniable, as though the chair itself had passed on a spark he thought forever lost. The hours stretched long into the night, the fire a dim pulse of warmth between men who shared no common tongue yet found ways to shape meaning from the air, from glances, from gestures rough but honest. Elias sat stiffly at first, his hand brushing the rifle more than once, his heart still tangled in suspicion, yet as the silence stretched, he found himself watching the leader, a man whose stillness was heavy, whose every scar told a story of survival and loss too vast to name, and in that quiet gravity Elias recognized something of himself, a mirror of pain etched into flesh and bone. The leader spoke little, his words clipped, fractured English that carried the jagged edges of war, but through them Elias pieced fragments: soldiers, pursuit, danger near, children at risk. When words failed, the man pointed to the boy in the rocking chair, then to the door, then lifted his hand flat and firm, like a wall breaking against the wind. And Elias understood they were fleeing, hunted, and the chase pressed close upon them. The women lowered their eyes as he spoke, one cradling a child who whimpered softly, and Elias felt again that piercing reminder of what he had lost, of fever stealing his girl from her bed, of the war taking his wife before her time, and the ache that had driven him into silence throbbed anew. He studied the leader's scars, long ridges across his shoulder, faint burns on his arms, wounds that had healed but never softened, and he thought of the jagged lines within himself, invisible but just as binding. It was in that moment he realized how much they were alike, two men on different sides of a frontier, both haunted, both carrying the unbearable weight of survival, both living among ghosts. For the first time, Elias set the rifle aside completely, leaning it against the far wall where it could not be mistaken for threat, and though his body trembled with the surrender, his spirit eased a fraction. The leader noticed. He inclined his head, just slightly, not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement, an unspoken admission that Elias's choice mattered. Their eyes met across the low glow of firelight, and in that locked gaze passed something deeper than words. The recognition of exile, the acknowledgement of wounds that no salve could ever heal, and the faintest spark of trust born not of friendship but of shared endurance. Elias felt it like a weight shifting, not lifted, but moved, and though he could not name it, he knew that in opening his door, in listening to these whispers of the past carved into another man's skin, he had allowed something into his cabin that solitude had long kept out. It was fragile, uneasy, and reluctant, but it was a bond nonetheless, and it flickered in the silence like the last ember of a dying fire, small, but alive. The first light of dawn crept pale and uncertain through the cracks in the shutters, painting Elias's cabin in muted stripes of gold and shadow, and for a moment he thought it would be another morning like all the others, filled with silence and the slow ache of survival. But then the sound reached him, hoofbeats, steady and many, rolling across the earth like distant thunder, and his heart clenched in recognition, for he had ridden in such formations once, had known the rhythm of cavalry horses pounding in unison, had felt pride swell in his chest at the sight of the flag unfurled against the open sky. He moved to the window, cautious, his hand trembling as he lifted the edge of the curtain, and there they were, soldiers riding in tight columns, their dust rising in great clouds behind them, the sun glinting off rifles slung against their shoulders, the same uniform he had once worn with honor folded neatly in the trunk at the foot of his bed, now moth-eaten but preserved like a relic of a man he no longer was. The weight of it pressed down on him, memories crashing like waves the day he signed his name. The battles fought, the brothers buried, and for a heartbeat he felt the pull of loyalty, the old duty whispering that he should step outside, raise his hand, and signal the soldiers to come, to fulfill the bond once sworn by blood and service. But then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, his gaze shifted from the horizon to the figures within his cabin, and he saw them clearly in the fragile morning light. The children huddled close to their mothers, eyes wide and shimmering with fear, small hands gripping tighter at skirts and shawls, the leader standing like a wall between them and the door, though even his silence carried the tremor of urgency. The boy still near the rocking chair, clutching the little carving he had been whittling, his lips pressed thin with a courage too young to be carried. Elias's chest tightened, the struggle tearing him in two, the soldier he had been demanding loyalty to his country, the man he had become whispering loyalty to something older and purer than any oath. His eyes drifted once more to the trunk where his uniform lay buried, the symbol of duty and obedience, and then to the fire where ashes glowed faint and gray, the reminder of all he had lost. He closed his eyes, drew a breath sharp with dust and memory, and when he opened them again, it was not the soldier who remained but the man, scarred and weary yet bound by the undeniable pull of humanity. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, echoing like judgment on the horizon, and Elias knew the moment of choice had come, not in the way of flags and commands, but in the quiet way of hearts and children. He set his jaw, turned from the window, and though fear coiled within him, his resolve burned hotter, for he understood at last that loyalty meant nothing if it asked him to betray the innocent who now looked to him for shelter. The hoofbeats grew heavier, closer, a drumbeat of inevitability that rattled the windows and pressed against Elias's chest, and in that sound he heard the tightening jaws of fate. Every instinct he had learned as a soldier screamed for him to act in accordance with duty, to open the door, raise his hand, and signal the riders that they had found their quarry. For had he not once sworn an oath to the same men who now scoured the land? Had he not shed blood beneath their banners and buried brothers under their flags? And did that oath not still bind him even if the uniform lay folded in a trunk, moth-bitten and forgotten? Yet as his eyes fell upon the cabin's interior, the mothers pulling their children into their arms, the young boy clutching the rocking chair's worn armrest as though it alone could anchor him, the Apache leader standing motionless yet braced, his silence louder than any plea, Elias felt another truth rise in him, one deeper and more primal than all the drilled commands and polished words of loyalty. To betray these people was to betray not only their fragile trust, but the very humanity that still flickered within him, a humanity he had thought buried with his wife and child. His palms sweated as he gripped the rifle, not from the thought of using it, but from the realization that no weapon could cut through this battle. It was not one of flesh and bone, but of conscience, and no matter his choice, blood would follow, whether the blood of innocence or the blood of his own honor. The silence inside the cabin was suffocating, the air charged with fear, yet beneath it Elias felt another presence, as though the ghosts who haunted him had gathered to bear witness, to watch whether he would betray all they had once meant to him. The soldier in him whispered. Betrayal was the only way to survive, to remain part of something larger than himself. But the father in him, the man who had held his fevered daughter until her small body went limp, who had dug into the hard earth with his own blistered hands to bury her, knew that survival meant nothing if it demanded the sacrifice of children. He stood caught between two worlds, the silence of his ranch no longer a balm but a crucible, a stage where the moral battle unfolded with every breath he drew. His heart pounded so fiercely he thought the soldiers outside must hear it over the thunder of their horses. The Apaches did not beg, did not speak, yet their very stillness seemed to say they understood his torment, that they too had stood in moments where every path led to loss. Elias closed his eyes, the weight of choice pressing down like an avalanche, and realized that for the first time in years he was not alone. His silence had become filled with consequence, and no matter what he chose, there would be no returning to the hollow man he had been before this night. Elias's decision did not come in a sudden rush, but in the slow, grinding resolve of a man who has weighed every cost and knows the scales will never balance, yet still must tip one way. And so, while the Apaches sat in tense silence, he moved with deliberate care, setting aside his rifle, reaching for the saddle worn smooth with years of neglect, and dragging it onto the back of his old horse that had not felt his weight in seasons. The animal shifted uneasily beneath him, as if sensing the burden of what was to come. His fingers fumbled with the straps at first, stiff from disuse, but at last they tightened, and when he swung his leg over, he felt the strange mix of familiarity and betrayal, as though mounting not just a horse but the very life he had left behind. He did not look back at the cabin, for he knew the eyes of the children and their mothers would pierce him too deeply, nor at the Apache leader, whose silence was heavier than any plea. But he felt them all the same, a weight pressing between his shoulder blades as he nudged the horse forward. The hoofbeats outside grew louder, more defined, and soon he was riding into the dust of their approach, heart pounding as though it meant to burst from his chest. The soldiers came into view, a hard line of blue coats and iron discipline, rifles slung at their sides, faces grim from long pursuit, and though they were younger than Elias remembered himself being, there was no mistaking the sameness of their purpose. They were hunters, and they believed themselves righteous. One of them raised a hand in greeting, calling out his name recognition flashing across weathered features, for Elias had once ridden with them, had once shared their campfires and carried their colors into battle. He swallowed hard, forcing his face into the stoic mask they would remember, and guided his horse closer, his voice steady when he answered, though his heart trembled with every syllable. He told them of tracks he had seen leading north, of the rough and hostile terrain that would delay their quarry, of waterholes dried and passes narrow with danger, each word spun carefully, stitched together with fragments of truth and the careful embroidery of lies, and he prayed the steadiness of his voice would hide the thunder of his guilt. The commander, a man with sharp eyes and a beard gone gray, studied him for a long moment, suspicion flickering but not catching flame, and at last he nodded, giving the order for the column to turn. The soldiers wheeled their horses, dust rising thick as smoke, and Elias sat frozen as they rode away, his chest a tangle of relief and sorrow, for though he had saved the lives in his cabin, he had betrayed the brothers in arms who once trusted him without question. The pounding of their horses faded into the distance, but the pounding of his heart remained, each beat a reminder that the choice he had made had severed him forever from the man he once was. Night came soft and heavy, the air cool and stirred by the sigh of prairie winds, carrying with it a sense of both ending and renewal, and Elias felt it in his bones as he watched the Apaches gather their meager belongings with quiet efficiency, their movements deliberate, unhurried, yet threaded with an urgency born of survival. They had lingered too long in his cabin, and though the soldiers had been diverted, danger still roamed close enough to taste in the dust, so they must slip away before dawn, back into the wilderness that had both hunted and sheltered them. Elias stood by the door, his hands loose at his sides, unsure whether to speak, unsure even if words had meaning in a moment that felt larger than language, and as he hesitated the Apache leader approached, his face carved in solemn lines, his eyes steady and unflinching, and without a word he lifted his hand and placed it firmly on Elias's shoulder. The touch was brief but heavy, carrying the weight of respect, of acknowledgement, of two men who had stood at the edge of betrayal and chosen instead the fragile bridge of trust, and Elias felt something stirred deep within him, something akin to absolution. Around them, the children gathered close to their mothers, and the young boy who had claimed the rocking chair lingered near the hearth, fidgeting with something in his small hands. When at last he moved, He did not speak, he simply walked to the chair, laid a small wooden carving upon the worn seat, and glanced up at Elias with eyes too knowing for his age, a silent gift that needed no explanation. Elias's throat tightened as he lifted it. A rough but careful carving of a horse, its legs strong, its head tilted as though ready to charge into open plains, and though it was crude, it was also filled with the boy's intent, gratitude, remembrance, a piece of himself left behind in the home of a stranger who had sheltered him. Elias could not speak, could not even thank him, for the weight of the gesture pressed too hard against the well of silence he had carried all these years, and so he only nodded, clutching the carving as though it were a lifeline. The leader gave the faintest incline of his head, then turned, signaling the others to follow, and together they slipped into the night, their forms merging with the shadows of the prairie, swallowed by the vastness of the land until they were no more than whispers carried by the wind. Elias remained at the doorway long after they vanished, the carving tight in his fist, the rocking chair still faintly swaying as though echoing the boy's presence. And for the first time in years he did not feel the crushing weight of emptiness pressing in on his walls. Instead, he felt the echo of lives that had passed through, fleeting yet profound, and as the fire dwindled to embers, he understood that the silence of his ranch had been altered forever, not broken, but changed, carrying within it the faint, enduring pulse of humanity. The dawn after their departure broke with a stillness that was different from the silence Elias had endured all those long years. It was not the oppressive emptiness that once pressed upon his chest like a stone, but a softer quiet, a quiet filled with memory, with the echo of voices that had passed through his cabin, with the faint warmth of a fire that had burned not just in his hearth but in his heart, rekindled by the presence of those who had sought shelter beneath his roof. He sat on the porch, hat low over his brow, and the prairie stretched endless before him, the same as it always had, yet altered in a way only he could feel. His eyes wandered to the rocking chair, where the little carving of the horse now rested in its seat, and he studied it as though it were a sacred relic, its crude lines holding within them a weight far greater than its size. He thought of the boy's gaze, steady and wordless, of the leader's hand on his shoulder, firm with respect, of the women who had held their children close in trust that he would protect them, and he realized that the knock on his door had not been a burden, not a threat, but a gift. For years, he had lived as though his soul had been buried with his wife and child, entombed in the soil of his ranch. Yet now he felt it stir again, fragile but alive, as though lifted by the very wind that rattled the grass beyond his fences. The uniform in the trunk still lay folded, the symbol of duty that had once defined him, but he no longer felt its weight binding him. Instead, he felt the heavier, truer weight of choice, the knowledge that he had stood at the crossroads of fear and compassion, and chosen not the path of obedience but of humanity. It would brand him a traitor in the eyes of his former brothers in arms if they ever learned the truth. But for the first time, he did not fear that judgment, for he had seen the faces of children spared, had felt the silent gratitude of a people driven to the edge, and he knew in his marrow that no allegiance to flag or uniform could outweigh the sanctity of life preserved. The ranch was quiet, yes, but no longer barren. Every creak of the rocking chair, every whisper of wind through the sagging fence posts, carried with it the reminder that he was not as empty as he once believed. The ghosts of his family still lingered, but they no longer haunted with despair. They stood with him in spirit, witnesses to the man he had chosen to become, not hollow, not broken, but transformed by the simple act of opening a door. Elias lifted the carving in his hand, tracing its rough edges with calloused fingers, and for the first time in years, he felt no need to ask the horizon for a sign. The sign had come, and it had given him back his soul.